Do you conduct a business in the Plenty Valley or surrounding area? If so, consider Plenty Valley FM 88.6 for your business promotion. Our rates are reasonable and results positive. Call 9404 2111 during business hours for more information.
Welcome to Spaced Out and the second episode of our Cosmology podcast series. In this episode, we follow the career path of Swinburne astrophysicist and Director of Programs at Astronomy Australia, Dr. James Murray. Thanks for joining us, James.
Hi, Denise. How are you going?
Very good, thanks. That's quite a big mouthful there. Director of Programs at Astronomy Australia. What work do you do with them?
Astronomy Australia is a small not-for-profit company that channels funding from the federal government into major infrastructure programs and projects for Australian astronomy research. So we look at projects that range from data and computing through to optical and radio astronomy and even up into gamma-ray astronomy and telescopes in Australia or overseas.
What sort of career path has led you to be part of Astronomy Australia?
So I started off doing a maths and science degree and a bit of engineering as well, and I was never really quite sure what I wanted to do, except that I wanted to keep studying. And when I got to starting my PhD, I marched into my supervisor's office and said, "Okay, what can I do?" And he says, "I've got two projects. Well, one is to look at gas flow around binary stars, and the other one is to look at the destruction of ancient Minoan civilization." And I didn't understand at the time, but they were essentially very, very similar projects looking at gas flow, one the flow of tidal waves and the other one being the flow of gas in between stars. And so I chose the stars and ended up doing my PhD and then followed that with a few postdocs in Canada and the UK. And before I knew it, I was a lecturer back at Swinburne building supercomputers for other people to model the evolution of the universe and all sorts of fun things like that. That took me probably a dozen years, and then I decided I wanted to step out beyond astronomy, so I ended up in banking.
Yes, I noticed that you've had some very senior roles. How did that compare really to what you were doing in astronomy?
I was always in roles that were quite quantitative in nature, so I was looking at risks for banks and whether they were overemphasising lending into particular sectors. And the techniques I was using were quite similar, but the language and the finances was something that I had to learn on the fly. There were some very, very challenging problems and looking at sort of whether too much money was being lent to the mining sector or to the farming sector for a particular bank to sort of to manage its risk. It was quite interesting because often you could see the results in front of you, but then you had to convince people that maybe their strategies were wrong and they weren't accounting for risk. And that became more and more interesting to me was the human factors involved in actually convincing people that that research was right. I was interested in that sort of human factor, but the finance ultimately, I was still working. I was still sort of probably volunteering a significant amount of time in schools and also with Mount Burnett, just sort of doing astronomy stuff. And I kind of realised that I hadn't finished in astronomy, so that's why I ended up back at Astronomy Australia.
And you're the current president of the Mount Burnett Observatory in Mount Burnett in Victoria. What sort of contributions have you enjoyed being the president for 8 years now?
I'd been sort of sniffing around the observatory prior to when it was still owned by Monash University, and I sort of knew it was sitting there, wasn't really being used. And I thought, well, why not make it into some sort of outreach or tourism place? And I didn't know there were 4 other guys from the Astronomical Society of Victoria who were also sort of looking at it and thinking that it could be put to better use. And so when Monash said, right, we don't want to use this anymore, we want to hand it back, we took it on. Well, I mean, when we first opened its doors, we kind of realised that there was a need. There was a sort of an observatory-shaped hole in the community that it was all of a sudden everyone realised they needed and wanted, and people just sort of came to it. and sort of were really, really happy to volunteer a lot of time and a lot of effort. And so it's been an incredible sort of journey. And over the last while, I've been sort of president, and I think what I've been able to bring to it is that understanding of the two different sides of astronomy, and that is the passion and the community side, as opposed to the frontline research, I think, that goes on in the universities, and being able to bring those two together allows us to create something that's a little bit different to other societies across Australia.
The field of cosmology is very much research-based. You've published a paper quite some time ago. It was about furnishing the galaxy with pulsars. What was this paper working towards?
Pulsars are rotating neutron stars, magnetized neutron stars, and we see them through if we happen to look down the poles, you can see them to sort of the bursts of radiation from them. And we can see them throughout the galaxy, but it's always been a challenge to try and work out why there are so many of them. And we know that the pulsars form in pairs. So the neutron star will have a companion that is the source of a lot of its mass and also its angular momentum, so that its spin. So this particular paper was actually written by a student that I shared with another researcher at Swinburne. And we basically came up with a model for evolving single stars and then added the two stars together. And when you put two stars very close together, you can find odd things happening, like one star evolves much more quickly than the other one and reaches the end of its life quite early on. And then the second star, once it starts to significantly evolve, changes through the evolutionary track of the first star by sort of donating mass or donating spin to it. And so that's where these pulsars come from. And these pulsars now, we're hoping to use them to have a second look at gravitational waves. They're very, very, very accurate clocks. So their spin might be accurate to one part in millionths, or even 10 to the 8, one part in 10 to the 8. So these pulsars can be distributed across very large distances. And if you manage to look at several of them simultaneously and measure the changes in their spin, that's another way of looking at the ripples in space that are gravitational waves. So that's where the frontiers are at the moment. People are looking at gravitational waves with enormous detectors that cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and they're based in America and Europe and Japan. But you can also use the stars themselves to have a look at the gravitational waves.
There was one other outcome too, amongst a few others, of the future work that was going to evolve from this particular paper. And one of them was predicting what the next generation of telescopes might be like, such as the Square Kilometre Array. You've had a lot to do with that project too, I believe.
The Square Kilometre Array is now actually going to be two telescopes, one in South Africa and one in Australia. And the Australian one is about to begin construction, but prior to actually building the SKA, they have built a couple of what they call precursor telescopes, where they test out the technology and build things on a smaller scale so that they can just say, essentially de-risk it, but also have a look to see if their science goals are actually on the money or if they need to change the way that they design things. So in Australia, the two precursors are called the Murchison Wide Field Array and the Australian SKA precursor, or OSCAP. And they've both been fabulously productive in scientific terms. So ASCAP, and my involvement is basically in the funding of them. So I sort of, my group ensures that they get the operational funding to keep them going. So ASCAP was instrumental in sort of identifying these things. The latest, astronomy is all about things that go bang. And one of the most recent discoveries were these things called fast radio bursts, or FRBs. And ASCAP has turned out to be an incredible machine for finding these across the universe. So the first one, I think, was discovered at Parkes. And initially they thought it was the microwave in the lunchroom going off while they were observing. And in fact, it was for one of them, but that still left an unexplained signal. And much later on, they went back and had a look at it, and they realised that is something in space going bang. And now ASCAP is finding these at a phenomenal rate. And people can then use other telescopes to go back and say, okay, exactly what is it? And then they're finding these that they're at cosmological distances, so in galaxies far, far away. The other precursor is the Murchison Wide Field Array, and that is, in fact, we've got a tile of that right up at Mount Burnett, which one of the prototype tiles they donated to us. It's a different sort of telescope to the one you're used to if you look at the movie The Dish, where you have a dish-shaped receiver that moves and points at different parts of the sky. The Murchison Wide Field Array is going to be like the Square Kilometre Array in that it is flat on the surface of the desert. It's composed of many, many, many receivers, and they don't move at all. But you can make the telescope point in different directions by just putting in delays between the signals that you get from each of the receivers, and you sort of virtually or inside a computer, you get the telescope to point in different directions. And this Murchison Wide Field Array has even discovered parts of our own atmosphere that we hadn't seen before. So there are all these little magnetic flux tubes in the outer atmosphere where lots of charged particles running up and down these flux tubes. That was just a sort of an incidental discovery while they're trying to actually work out what was going on beyond the atmosphere. Again, an incredibly valuable telescope, and it's going to mean that when the Square Kilometre Array gets built in the next couple of years, we'll be able to do it without making too many mistakes.
You've been involved in cosmology for many years. Cosmology is a vast subject. What might be your most challenging achievement to date?
Many, many, many years ago, when I was a postdoc at CETA, which is the Canadian Institute for Theoretical Astrophysics in Toronto, I wrote some code to actually try and work out where magnetic fields come from, because these are hidden in a lot of astronomical problems, because stars form, galaxies form, and they're all, if you look at them all, like look at the solar system or the galaxy, you'll notice that it's spinning and it's quite flat. One of the most challenging problems in astronomy is how do you get a very large object to transfer its angular momentum or its spin from the inside out? And magnetic fields are a very useful mechanism for potentially doing that. But then where do the magnetic fields come from? So many, many years ago, I wrote some codes to come up with an initial view on how that might happen. That work's been sort of advanced much, much more since then. The codes that you might see, for example, that evolved the entire universe, evolving from the Big Bang all the way down to now, that will take decades of work for people to sort of write, test, and then run. And as computers get bigger and bigger and bigger, then the codes get better and better. So when I started out in cosmology, we had a problem because some of the oldest stars in the universe are apparently older than the age of the universe that you get from other estimates. So the age of the universe is somewhere in between 12 and 20 billion years old, and the Hubble constant was somewhere in between 50 and 100. And now we know the universe is 13.72 billion years old, so the field has kind of evolved in a very, very dramatic fashion.
Cosmology certainly is an incredible area. Thank you for spending your valuable time with us. Would love to talk to you further about different fields of cosmology that you're working in the future.
I've enjoyed it very much. Thank you, Denise.
I love the local news.
I love the music variety.
And all the local sport.
24 hours a day. It's all local. 88.6 Plenty Valley FM.